A long-awaited reunion. Isaiah Green was no stranger to the world of business, a realm where power and prestige were often defined by the most subtle of interactions. But this was different. His hands tightened on the armrest as he tried to process what was happening. It was a routine flight, one he had taken many times before. Yet, this was the first time he felt like an outsider in a place that should have been familiar. He could feel the tension rising in the cabin, and it wasn't just because of the confrontation with the flight attendant. It was something else. Something far deeper. The flight attendant's insistence on questioning his seat assignment, especially when he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that everything was in order, was unsettling. The way she spoke to him, the way her eyes seemed to scrutinize him with suspicion, was not just about the seat or the flight. It was about the unspoken expectations of who belonged in first class. He had encountered these types of subtle biases before, the kind that didn't always show up as overt racism, but rather in small, dismissive gestures, like being overlooked or made to feel invisible. They were the kind of microaggressions that chipped away at a person's sense of belonging, and Isaiah had learned to ignore them over the years, focusing instead on what he had built with his own hands, a multi-billion-dollar company that had grown from a humble startup to a global powerhouse. But today, in this moment, he couldn't ignore it. The flight attendant's behavior was a blatant reminder of the struggles he had faced as a black man in a predominantly white, high-powered world. "I don't understand what the issue is," Isaiah said again, this time his voice colder. His patience was wearing thin, and the eyes of the other passengers seemed to grow sharper, more judgmental. "You're asking me to leave a flight I've already boarded, on a seat I've already paid for. And you're questioning my legitimacy. Why?" His words hung in the air, thick with the weight of years of inequity, of hidden prejudices that could never be fully eradicated. The cabin fell silent. For a brief moment, it felt as though time had slowed down, the humming engines fading into the background, the sound of Elijah's soft breathing the only thing that could be heard. Maya's fingers tightened around Isaiah's hand, offering him silent support, but also trying to keep their son unaware of the growing tension. The flight attendant stood her ground, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her expression now. Her professional demeanor wavered, but she still didn't relent. "I'm just following protocol," she said. "There's been a discrepancy in the system. I can't let this go unaddressed. I'll have to escort you off the plane, sir." It was the word escort that struck Isaiah the hardest. It wasn't just an inconvenience, or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate, condescending decision to remove him. Without any justification, without any reason other than her own misguided assumptions. And the fact that the entire cabin was now fully aware of the interaction, that they were watching him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, only made things worse. Isaiah's gaze scanned the room, seeing some passengers exchange uncomfortable glances, others murmuring in hushed tones. A few looked directly at him, but there was no empathy in their eyes. "I've flown first class for years," Isaiah continued, his voice steady but tinged with an emotion he hadn't expected to feel. "I know the rules. I know the procedures. And this is wrong. I am not going anywhere." The flight attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. She opened her mouth to argue again, but before she could, a voice came from behind Isaiah, cutting through the tension like a knife. "Is there a problem here?" Isaiah turned in his seat, and his heart skipped a beat. The man who had spoken was no stranger to him, he was the CEO of the airline itself. The tall, well-groomed figure in a tailored black suit stood in the aisle, his eyes scanning the situation with a mixture of surprise and concern. His name was David Hargrove, and Isaiah had met him on several occasions at corporate events and industry conferences. At first, Isaiah couldn't quite understand why David, the CEO of the airline, would be here, standing in the aisle of his flight. But then it hit him. The situation had escalated beyond a simple misunderstanding, it was now a matter that would reflect poorly on the airline. And that, for someone in David's position, was a matter of importance. "Mr. Green," David said, his voice carrying a note of authority as he moved toward Isaiah's seat. "Is everything all right?" Isaiah stood up, his gaze meeting David's with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "There's a problem, all right," he said. "This flight attendant," he pointed toward the woman who had just moments ago demanded he leave, "is accusing me of not belonging in this seat. She's questioning my entire existence here, and I've done nothing wrong." The CEO's gaze shifted from Isaiah to the flight attendant, who was now visibly uncomfortable. He looked back at Isaiah with an expression that shifted from concern to understanding. "I see," he said quietly, his eyes narrowing in thought. "I'll take care of this." He motioned for the flight attendant to step aside, and she obeyed without protest, though she seemed reluctant to leave the situation. As she moved toward the rear of the cabin, David turned to Isaiah, lowering his voice. "Mr. Green," he began, his tone now softer, though still laced with professional respect. "I'm terribly sorry this happened. I didn't realize you were on this flight. I can assure you this is not the experience we want to provide our passengers, especially someone like you." Isaiah's brow furrowed at the word "someone like you." He had heard that phrase used before, the implication that he didn't quite belong in certain spaces. He was tired of hearing it, tired of letting it slide. "Someone like me?" Isaiah repeated, his voice now sharp. "What does that mean, exactly?" David's eyes flickered with a brief flash of regret, but he quickly recovered. "I mean no disrespect," he said quickly. "But you're more than just a customer. Your name, your company, it carries weight in this industry." Isaiah's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure if David was aware of just how much weight his name carried, or, for that matter, how much David himself had to lose if this situation wasn't handled carefully. The airline CEO continued, "I'll make sure this is resolved, and I'll personally ensure that something like this doesn't happen again." But before Isaiah could respond, the flight attendant, who had been quietly standing near the rear of the cabin, was now approaching again, this time with an air of reluctance. "I'm terribly sorry, sir," she said, her tone noticeably softer. "I didn't realize. I mean, I didn't know who you were. It was a misunderstanding. I thought you might have been in the wrong seat." Isaiah's lips pressed into a thin line. "It wasn't a misunderstanding," he said coolly. "It was a decision based on assumptions, based on something other than facts. I've worked my entire life to get to this point. To be here. To be in this seat. I deserve this seat." David, sensing the tension, nodded sharply. "Yes, Mr. Green. I understand, and I'll make sure we address this internally. Please accept my deepest apologies for this." But the apology, while appreciated, felt hollow. The truth was undeniable, this was more than just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger problem, an issue that ran deep, beyond this flight, beyond this airline. And Isaiah knew that the changes that needed to happen couldn't come from just one apology. They needed to come from systemic change, a shift in the way the world perceived people like him. He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Thank you, David. But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." The CEO watched him with a mixture of respect and understanding, before turning to address the rest of the cabin, trying to bring the situation back under control. But the ripple effect of this encounter had already begun. The passengers, who had quietly observed the unfolding drama, were now aware of the underlying issues. What started as an isolated incident had now become a conversation, one that would extend far beyond this flight. As the plane continued its journey, Isaiah couldn't help but think about the larger implications of what had just happened. This wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or undervalued. And he knew that this encounter would lead to a change that no one could have anticipated, the unraveling truth. The silence in the cabin stretched as Isaiah sank back into his seat, the weight of the conversation lingering long after David Hargrove had addressed the rest of the passengers. The flight attendant, now nervously avoiding eye contact with him, retreated to the back of the plane. Though the tension in the air seemed to dissipate, it was only replaced by an uncomfortable quiet that seemed to settle over the entire cabin. Isaiah could feel the eyes of the other passengers, some curious, some judgmental, all aware of the moment that had just transpired. But it wasn't just them who were affected, Isaiah was shaken too. His fingers were still curled tightly around the armrest, though he no longer noticed it. His mind was racing. He had worked his entire life to get to this point, to be in this seat, and yet here he was, a man who had built a multi-billion-dollar empire, being questioned and humiliated in front of a plane full of strangers. He could sense Maya's discomfort beside him. Her hand was now in his, squeezing gently, but there was a quiet tension in her eyes that mirrored his own. "Elijah, sweetie, go back to sleep," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible, yet carrying the same tension that clung to the air. Elijah, still groggy from the earlier interruption, nodded and snuggled back into her lap, his small form curling up peacefully once again. Isaiah's eyes traced the contours of his son's face. Elijah was still a child, untouched by the prejudices that had plagued Isaiah's life for years. It was a bittersweet thought, a reminder of the world Elijah had yet to navigate, a world where people would always be eager to question his worth because of the color of his skin. Isaiah's gaze turned to the window, the landscape below now shrouded in the quiet darkness of night. His mind wandered, his thoughts floating back to the years that had brought him here. To the days spent in cramped offices, the long hours in boardrooms, the sacrifices he had made to get to this point. He had always known that he would face challenges in his career, but he had never expected something so personal, so degrading, to happen in a place where he thought he belonged. His company, Green Enterprises, had started from the ground up. It had been a dream born from nothing more than a vision and a refusal to accept the status quo. Isaiah had fought tooth and nail to turn that dream into reality. And now, years later, it had grown into an international conglomerate, a business empire that spanned continents. But the wealth, the power, the success, it never seemed to protect him from the prejudices that lived in the hearts of some people. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Suddenly, a voice broke through his thoughts. "Mr. Green," came David Hargrove's voice again, this time through the intercom. "I'd like to speak with you in private after we land. Please stay on the plane for a few minutes when we reach the gate." Isaiah exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He had known the conversation wasn't over. It couldn't be. But he wasn't sure what else David had to say, or what the CEO of the airline could offer him at this point. Apologies, compensation? What could make up for the humiliation he had just endured? The rest of the flight passed in a blur, the minutes stretching on endlessly as Isaiah wrestled with his thoughts. His mind drifted from one idea to the next, thoughts of his business, of his family, of the world he had built, and now of the system that allowed this kind of subtle racism to fester. He thought about his competitors, some of whom were still skeptical of his ability to lead because of his race. There had been whispers behind closed doors, subtle nods, a quiet resistance to the idea that someone like him could be successful on his own terms. Even now, in the comfort of a first-class seat, Isaiah was reminded that the world was not always kind, nor was it ever fair. But that same drive, that same fire that had pushed him through the hardest of days, still burned in his chest. He had faced obstacles far greater than this before. And he was not about to let this moment define him. The plane touched down smoothly, the hum of the engines shifting as the craft glided toward the terminal. Passengers began to stir, gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark. The flight attendants moved about, their faces now slipping back into their professional masks. But for Isaiah, the weight of what had happened still lingered. As the plane came to a full stop and the seatbelt sign dinged off, Isaiah looked at Maya, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and weariness. She didn't need to say anything, he could see the unspoken support in her gaze. She was with him, as always, through every trial and tribulation. "We'll handle this," Isaiah said quietly, more to himself than to her. Maya nodded, a subtle smile tugging at her lips. "I know you will." As the passengers filed off the plane, Isaiah remained seated. He could feel the weight of the moment, of the conversation that would follow. But he wasn't afraid. He had faced challenges far greater than this, and he had always come out stronger on the other side. A few moments later, David Hargrove appeared at the door, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim light of the terminal. "Mr. Green," he said, his voice far more deferential than before. "I'd like to apologize again. I don't know what else to say, but this situation was completely unacceptable." Isaiah stood, his posture straightening as he turned to face the CEO. "You're right. It was unacceptable. But the apology isn't enough. Not this time." David looked taken aback, but he nodded. "I understand. And that's why I want to discuss this further. I don't just want to fix the situation with you, I want to address the underlying issue. This isn't just about you, or me. It's about the way people of color are treated in spaces like this. The subtle discrimination that still exists. It needs to stop." Isaiah's eyes narrowed. Was this genuine? Or was this just damage control? It was hard to tell. But he knew one thing for sure, David wasn't just the CEO of an airline. He was a man with influence. And if he was willing to take responsibility, then maybe, just maybe, this could be a turning point. "I've worked my whole life to build something that matters," Isaiah said, his voice firm but measured. "And I've faced obstacles because of who I am. Not because of what I've done. But because of assumptions people make about me. About people like me. And it's not just in business. It's everywhere." David nodded slowly, understanding the weight of Isaiah's words. "I agree. And I want to help change that. I want to use the resources of this airline, the platform we have, to open up a conversation. To raise awareness. To challenge these assumptions." Isaiah studied David for a long moment. He had heard promises like this before, he had seen executives, politicians, and public figures make similar statements when the pressure was on. But there was something in David's eyes now, something that suggested he wasn't just speaking to appease Isaiah. He was speaking because he understood. "All right," Isaiah said, finally breaking the silence. "But this can't be just talk. It has to be action. Real action. I'm willing to help, but I need to see change." David's eyes glinted with determination. "You have my word. We'll do this right. Together." And with that, the conversation began to take on a new direction, one that would ripple outward, affecting not just the airline, but the corporate world at large. The issue of systemic racism, so often swept under the rug, was now front and center. The changes that would follow were not just about fixing one wrong, they were about dismantling the structures that allowed this behavior to persist in the first place. And Isaiah Green, the man who had once been underestimated, now found himself at the heart of a movement that could change the very fabric of corporate culture. As Isaiah walked off the plane, his family by his side, he knew that this was only the beginning. The journey ahead would be difficult, but it was one worth taking. For the sake of his son, for the sake of his community, and for the sake of the future, Isaiah Green was ready to fight. Breaking boundaries. The days that followed the flight were a whirlwind of discussions, decisions, and a level of scrutiny that Isaiah Green had never experienced before. He was used to media attention, used to being at the center of public discourse. His success had always kept him in the public eye, whether in the boardroom or at conferences, his every move was analyzed. But this situation felt different. This was more than just a corporate strategy, more than a PR fix. It was personal. And it was complicated. David Hargrove, the CEO of the airline, had followed through on his promise. The two men met several times after the flight, discussing the incident, brainstorming ideas for systemic change, and examining how they could use their respective platforms to tackle the very issues that had caused this breakdown in the first place. The meetings were long, sometimes tense, but always forward-focused. The question was no longer about what had happened on that flight, it was about what needed to happen next. It wasn't just about a single apology. It was about reshaping an entire culture, about rethinking the deeply ingrained assumptions that had led to this moment. And Isaiah knew that if they were going to make a meaningful impact, they couldn't do it alone. They needed to bring others into the conversation. David suggested reaching out to other companies, influencers, and thought leaders, people who had already been vocal about the importance of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And while Isaiah was skeptical at first, he recognized the potential for collaboration. If this was going to be bigger than just one airline or one CEO's promises, it had to be a movement. A movement that could challenge industries and systems from the inside out. Isaiah's role was clear: he would use his platform, his influence, to lead the charge. It was something he had never anticipated, but something he felt compelled to do. It wasn't just about his personal experience anymore, it was about changing the narrative for all Black people, for all people who had been underestimated, ignored, or discarded. In the days that followed, the news of the incident spread quickly. Social media erupted in conversations, with many praising Isaiah for standing his ground and demanding accountability. There was also an outpouring of support from other high-profile figures, business executives, activists, and even some politicians, who saw this as an opportunity to address the broader issue of racial inequality in the workplace and beyond. The airline's involvement in the matter didn't go unnoticed either, and while some hailed it as a brave step toward change, others were more cynical, questioning whether the airline's efforts were genuine or merely an attempt to repair its public image. As the days turned into weeks, Isaiah and David worked together to create a comprehensive plan that would not only address the immediate concerns but also set a precedent for how companies could act when confronted with issues of systemic racism. They began drafting a series of public statements, press releases, and social media posts that would communicate their commitment to change. They also began working with experts in the fields of diversity and inclusion, consulting with thought leaders who had long been advocating for policies and practices that promoted fairness and equity in the corporate world. But it wasn't just about words. It was about action. They discussed implementing unconscious bias training for all employees, starting with the airline staff, but eventually expanding it to other sectors. They also brainstormed creating a scholarship program that would provide opportunities for underrepresented individuals in the airline industry to receive mentorship, training, and education in leadership and management. The idea was to cultivate a new generation of leaders who understood the importance of diversity and inclusion. The corporate world was watching closely. Many executives were eager to see if this was just a momentary trend or a genuine shift in how businesses would operate in the future. Isaiah was determined to make it the latter. He had never been one to back down from a challenge, and this was no different. He wasn't just fighting for justice in a single incident, he was fighting for an entire system to change, for an entire culture to evolve. And he knew that this battle would not be fought in boardrooms or press conferences alone. It would be fought in schools, in communities, in workplaces. Isaiah had always believed that success came through persistence, through the relentless pursuit of what was right. But now, he realized that success could also come through collaboration, through the recognition that change was something that required the collective effort of everyone involved. This was bigger than just him and his company. This was about creating a world where people didn't have to fight to be seen, to be heard, to be valued. Maya, who had been by his side throughout the entire ordeal, had been his anchor, offering him the perspective he needed when his mind threatened to run away with him. She had always been the more grounded of the two of them, the one who reminded him of his roots and his values when the weight of his success seemed too much to bear. And this was no different. As the days passed, and the pressure of the task ahead mounted, it was Maya's calm and steady presence that kept him focused. "Isaiah," she said one evening, as they sat in their living room after another long day of meetings, "I know this is hard. But I also know you. You've always fought for what's right. You've always fought for fairness, even when it wasn't easy. And this is no different." Her words were simple, but they struck a chord deep within him. Maya wasn't just reminding him of his strength, she was reminding him of his purpose. He had never been in this position before, but he knew that if he didn't push forward now, then who would? "Do you think it's enough?" Isaiah asked, his voice weary. "All these meetings, these ideas, is it enough to really make a difference?" Maya took a deep breath, her gaze steady as she looked him in the eye. "It's a start. And starts are powerful. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with someone being willing to stand up and say, 'This is wrong. And we can do better.'" Isaiah nodded slowly. He knew she was right. This wasn't just about one flight attendant or one airline, it was about dismantling the walls that kept people like him from truly being seen. People who had always been told they didn't belong, that they weren't worthy of certain privileges. This was bigger than a momentary incident, it was the beginning of a revolution in how businesses would operate and how people of color would be treated within those spaces. The weight of the task before him seemed both daunting and invigorating. There were no guarantees, no promises that this would succeed. But as the days passed, Isaiah felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced before. This wasn't just about changing one industry, it was about changing the way the world operated. And as the initiative began to take shape, as the conversation spread across social media, as businesses, influencers, and thought leaders began to get involved, Isaiah could see that the momentum was building. He wasn't alone in this fight. This was a collective effort, one that would ripple through industries and communities alike. People were waking up to the reality of systemic racism, to the ways it had shaped every facet of society, from the workplace to the airport, from schools to boardrooms. The pressure was immense, but Isaiah wasn't afraid. He knew that this was a fight worth having, and a fight he was more than ready to take on unforeseen allies. As the weeks rolled by, Isaiah's life became a whirlwind of media appearances, interviews, and meetings. The buzz surrounding the airline incident had ignited a firestorm of public discourse, and the world was watching. There were skeptics, of course, critics who believed that the conversation would fizzle out once the media attention died down. But there were also people who saw the potential for real change, people who were eager to take action. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of interviews, Isaiah sat in his office, reviewing the latest reports from his company. His mind was heavy with thoughts of the movement he had inadvertently helped to spark. Despite all the positive media coverage, Isaiah couldn't shake the feeling that he was still just one person in a vast sea of resistance. The obstacles ahead of him were daunting, and the expectations that people had for him felt suffocating at times. He had taken on this fight to honor his son, to create a world where Elijah and others like him wouldn't have to struggle for acceptance in places where they rightfully belonged. But now that the fight was in full swing, it was harder than he'd imagined. His phone buzzed on the desk, interrupting his thoughts. The name on the screen was unexpected, Angela Porter. Angela was a well-known activist and the CEO of a successful nonprofit that focused on diversity and inclusion in the corporate world. She was a woman who had spent decades advocating for the kind of change Isaiah was now championing. The two of them had crossed paths a few times at various events, but they had never worked together directly. Isaiah hesitated for a moment before answering the call. "Hello, Angela," he said, trying to mask the exhaustion in his voice. "What's on your mind?" "I've been following everything closely," Angela's voice came through the line, clear and direct. "And I've been thinking about the direction this movement could take. I think we're at a tipping point, Isaiah. People are finally starting to listen. But we need more than just conversations. We need action. And we need it fast. Isaiah sat up straighter in his chair. He had always respected Angela's passion and drive, but hearing her speak with such urgency made him realize how high the stakes were. He had been so focused on the intricacies of his own company's involvement that he hadn't yet fully considered the broader impact this movement could have. "I agree," Isaiah replied, his mind racing. "But the question is, where do we go from here? How do we keep the momentum going?" Angela didn't hesitate. "It's time to take this to the next level. We've been talking about diversity and inclusion for decades. But now we need policies that address the root of the problem, systemic racism. We need companies to sign on to a pledge that commits them to taking measurable steps to combat discrimination in the workplace. And we need to hold them accountable, not just with words but with actions. We need transparency." Isaiah felt the weight of her words. This wasn't just about the airline. This was about reshaping an entire corporate culture, one that had long been resistant to change. But Angela was right. Words alone wouldn't be enough. They needed concrete actions, clear metrics to measure progress, and a structure that would ensure companies couldn't simply pay lip service to diversity without actually changing their practices. He leaned forward, a new sense of determination settling over him. "So, what do you suggest?" "We need a coalition," Angela said firmly. "A coalition of companies, executives, and activists who are committed to this fight. We need to create a framework for real change, one that can be applied across industries. We can start by bringing together some of the most influential business leaders in the country, those who have already shown they're willing to make a difference. But we need to make this an inclusive effort. We need to involve people from all sectors, all backgrounds, and all walks of life. This can't be a movement for just one group. It needs to be for everyone." Isaiah sat in silence for a moment, considering Angela's words. The idea of a coalition, of uniting people across industries and sectors, was bold. But it also felt like the next logical step. The conversation surrounding racial inequality couldn't just be a passing trend, it had to be embedded into the fabric of every major industry. And that meant bringing together the people who held the power to change things. "I like the sound of that," Isaiah said slowly. "But I'm going to need help. A lot of it. And we need to get this right. We need to ensure that every company and individual who signs on is genuinely committed to making change, not just because it's trendy, but because it's necessary." Angela's voice softened. "I know you're up for this, Isaiah. You've been fighting for fairness your whole life. You've already made more progress than most people could in a lifetime. But now it's time to go bigger. We can't afford to wait any longer." "I'm in," Isaiah replied, his voice firm. "Let's do it." The days that followed were a blur of intense planning and coordination. Isaiah, with Angela's guidance, reached out to other influential CEOs and leaders, people like Marcus Thompson, a tech mogul who had made diversity a cornerstone of his company's mission, and Sarah Cohen, an environmental advocate who had spent years working with corporations to ensure sustainability and social responsibility were at the forefront of their operations. Each of them saw the importance of this moment, each of them knew that the time for passive action had passed. The coalition, once formed, was an eclectic group. It wasn't just a collection of business leaders. It was a group of individuals from various industries, communities, and backgrounds, all united by the common goal of dismantling systemic inequality in corporate America. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Every member of the coalition would commit to implementing tangible changes within their organizations, changes that would not only promote diversity and inclusion but would also challenge the practices that perpetuated discrimination and bias. As the coalition began to take shape, the impact was immediate. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a historic collaboration. And though the initial media attention focused on the idea of business leaders coming together to fight racism, it was clear that this was a pivotal moment. The coalition wasn't just about fixing corporate policies, it was about pushing the conversation about race and inequality to the highest levels of power. It was about challenging the status quo and saying, "We will not tolerate this anymore." But just as the momentum was building, the resistance began to show itself. On the surface, the corporate world seemed to be embracing the movement. Executives who had been silent on the issue of racial inequality for years were now publicly declaring their commitment to change. But there was an undercurrent of hesitation, an uncertainty about how much change they were truly willing to embrace. The skeptics were many. Some feared that this movement would disrupt the established order, threatening their control over markets and resources. Others saw it as a challenge to their bottom line, worried that addressing issues of racial inequality would cost too much in the short term. And some simply didn't believe that real change was possible. Isaiah had dealt with resistance before, but this was different. These were people who didn't want to lose their power, who didn't want to risk the comfort and privilege that had been afforded to them by the very systems they now had to confront. But Isaiah knew better than to let the skeptics define the conversation. He had worked too hard to let fear dictate the future. He had a vision of a corporate world where people of all races and backgrounds had an equal opportunity to succeed, a world where the color of a person's skin didn't determine their worth. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. But with his allies by his side, he was ready to keep pushing forward. The fight had only just begun. The tipping point. As Isaiah continued to forge ahead with the coalition, the stakes grew higher. What had started as a singular moment of personal frustration, a flight attendant doubting his presence on a plane, had evolved into something much larger. The movement was no longer just about one incident, one flight, one company. It was about something far more profound, the realization that the systemic barriers people of color faced were deeply embedded in every corner of society. And while progress was being made, Isaiah knew the real battle lay in ensuring that the momentum was sustained. Change didn't happen overnight, it required vigilance, commitment, and, most importantly, action. At the heart of the coalition's efforts was the need for accountability. One by one, members of the group took turns sharing their stories of discrimination, of battles fought in silence, and of systemic bias that they had witnessed in their respective industries. These were powerful moments, raw and unvarnished stories that painted a stark picture of just how deeply racism ran through the fabric of corporate America. But they also served as a call to action. They weren't just sharing their pain, they were setting the stage for something transformative. Isaiah knew that for the coalition to truly succeed, it needed to push beyond empty promises and performative gestures. This wasn't about token diversity initiatives or quick fixes. This was about genuine change, about rewriting the rules and creating structures that would hold everyone accountable. As the weeks went by, a comprehensive plan began to take shape. The coalition had set its sights on several key initiatives: the establishment of mentorship programs for underrepresented groups, mandatory diversity and inclusion training across industries, transparency reports from companies showing their hiring practices and representation, and the development of a universal diversity standard that would allow customers and clients to know which companies were truly committed to equity. The response from the public was overwhelming. Social media was ablaze with discussions, debates, and support for the coalition's efforts. Influencers, activists, and everyday people rallied behind the movement. What had once been an isolated incident had now become a nationwide conversation. People of all races, backgrounds, and political affiliations were discussing how best to confront the deeply embedded issues of racism and bias. It was a movement that was no longer confined to boardrooms or corporate offices. It was spilling out into the streets, into living rooms, into schools, and into every corner of society. But as the conversation grew louder, so did the opposition. In the shadow of the coalition's success, corporate giants began to worry. They feared the scrutiny that came with being part of this movement. Some worried about the impact it would have on their bottom lines, while others simply weren't ready to confront the uncomfortable truths that the movement demanded they face. There were phone calls, private meetings, and whispers in high-rise offices. Several influential CEOs, once vocal supporters of the initiative, began to retreat. They hesitated, unsure of how far they were willing to go. Isaiah sensed this shift. The tide of support was still strong, but the cracks were beginning to show. He had expected resistance from the beginning, it was inevitable. But this felt different. These weren't just the usual detractors. These were the power brokers, the ones who controlled the levers of influence. They had the resources to make or break the movement. And their hesitation was a signal that this fight was far from over. One particular day, after a high-stakes conference call with several coalition members, Isaiah found himself alone in his office, staring out at the skyline. He had always prided himself on his ability to adapt, to pivot when necessary, but this was uncharted territory. The pressure was mounting, and the future of the movement was uncertain. It was then that Maya entered the room. Her presence was a calming influence, something he had come to rely on in moments of doubt. She was holding a cup of tea in one hand, her other hand resting gently on his shoulder. "You've been working non-stop," she said softly. "Maybe it's time for a break." Isaiah shook his head. "I wish I could. But the more I do, the more I see just how far we have to go. It's not enough to get people talking, Maya. We need real change. We need them to act. And right now, some of the biggest companies in the world are backing off." Maya sat beside him, placing the cup on the desk. "You knew this wouldn't be easy." "I did," he replied. "But it feels like we're standing at a precipice. We've come so far, and yet it feels like we're just one step away from losing it all. I can feel the pushback. I can feel the resistance from those at the top. And it's scary." Maya gave him a reassuring look. "The most important changes never come without resistance. You're up against a system that's been in place for decades. It's going to push back, hard. But that doesn't mean you stop. It means you push harder." Isaiah nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had always been confident in his decisions, but this felt like the most difficult challenge he had ever faced. It wasn't just about one fight, it was about changing the very fabric of an industry, of an entire culture. As the days passed, Isaiah spent less time in the spotlight and more time strategizing with the core members of the coalition. He knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be smooth, but it was the only road worth taking. The opposition was growing louder, but the coalition was beginning to show signs of strength. The discussions were becoming more unified, more focused on actionable steps. There was a sense of urgency now. Isaiah was no longer just reacting to the challenges that came his way, he was anticipating them. He reached out to people who had previously been silent on the issue, asking them to lend their voices, to commit to this cause. He knew that the more voices that joined the chorus, the harder it would be for the powerful forces in the background to suppress the movement. But it wasn't just about the business leaders. Isaiah was determined to ensure that this wasn't a movement led solely by corporate giants. The voices of everyday people, those whose lives were most directly impacted by racial inequality, had to be heard. He began organizing community events, town halls, and interviews with grassroots leaders who had been advocating for change long before the coalition even existed. Their stories were just as important, just as powerful, and they couldn't be ignored. In a pivotal moment, Isaiah spoke at a rally in front of a crowd of thousands, including many of the coalition's key supporters. The energy was palpable, the atmosphere electric. People from all walks of life had gathered to witness the culmination of months of work, and Isaiah felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. He took the stage, his voice steady, his resolve unshaken. "This movement isn't just about diversity," he said, looking out over the crowd. "It's about humanity. It's about dignity. It's about ensuring that every person, regardless of the color of their skin, has an equal opportunity to succeed. We've seen the injustices, we've heard the stories, and we will no longer remain silent. This is just the beginning. And together, we will bring about a future where everyone can rise, no matter where they come from." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound deafening, but Isaiah's mind was already turning. He knew that this was only the start. There would be roadblocks, there would be obstacles, but he was no longer uncertain. The fight had ignited something much bigger than him. It had sparked a movement that was already changing the world, the ripple effect. The days after the rally were a whirlwind of activity, but this time, there was a palpable shift. It was no longer just Isaiah leading the charge, it was the collective will of an entire nation, pushing for change. People had seen the rallies, the media coverage, and the viral videos of Isaiah's speech. And in the weeks that followed, the movement had snowballed. From corporate boardrooms to neighborhood coffee shops, the conversation about systemic racism, diversity, and inclusion was now unavoidable. There was an undeniable momentum that no one could ignore. Isaiah's phone rang incessantly, a steady stream of calls from supporters, fellow CEOs, activists, and even political leaders. Everyone wanted to be part of the conversation, to lend their voice to the cause. There was a newfound urgency to take the movement beyond the walls of corporate America and into the public sphere. The time for dialogue had passed, now, it was time for transformative action. But with this newfound influence came a growing pressure. Isaiah had known from the start that change wouldn't come easily, but now, as the movement gained national attention, the stakes had risen exponentially. He had to balance the demands of his company, his family, and the coalition, all while dealing with the relentless media spotlight. Despite the overwhelming support, there was still significant resistance from certain sectors. Some of the wealthiest and most influential individuals in the country were quietly mobilizing against the movement, using their considerable resources to sow doubt, to pit people against one another, and to delay the inevitable changes that were coming. Isaiah had long known that true power didn't come from financial resources alone, it came from the people, from the collective voice of those who had been marginalized for too long. But he couldn't ignore the fact that those opposing change had the ability to influence political decisions, policy, and even public perception. The pressure was mounting, and for a moment, Isaiah found himself reflecting on everything that had brought him here. It wasn't just the flight incident anymore. It wasn't even just about the airline. It was about redefining what it meant to truly create a fair and just society, a society where people were judged by their character and contributions, not by the color of their skin. One night, after a particularly exhausting day of strategizing with the coalition, Isaiah sat down with Maya in their living room. The weight of everything, every decision, every word, every action, felt heavy on his shoulders. Maya, as always, could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "You're carrying a lot," she said gently, sitting down beside him and resting her head on his shoulder. "But you're not carrying it alone." Isaiah let out a breath, grateful for her presence. "Sometimes it feels like I am, though. I know I have the support of the coalition, of all these people who are committed to this cause. But when it gets this big, it feels overwhelming." Maya squeezed his hand. "You didn't start this fight alone. And you won't finish it alone either. You've sparked something in people that can't be extinguished. People are ready for change, and they're not backing down. Neither should you." He nodded slowly, a sense of resolve beginning to settle in. Maya was right. He had sparked a revolution, a shift in how people viewed corporate responsibility and systemic inequality. The coalition was stronger than ever, and though the road ahead was fraught with challenges, Isaiah knew that he couldn't afford to waver now. The following week, Isaiah attended a private meeting with several prominent politicians. The atmosphere in the room was tense. The conversation had reached a critical juncture. Lawmakers were beginning to take notice of the movement and were eager to translate the public outcry into policy. But, as always, there were those who were reluctant to push for meaningful reform. Some politicians were afraid of alienating their corporate donors, while others believed that the changes being proposed were too radical. Isaiah took a deep breath as he addressed the room. His voice was calm but firm. The time for half measures is over. The people are asking for real change, and they're not going to wait any longer. We need policies that not only address discrimination but also dismantle the systems that perpetuate it. We need transparency in hiring practices, we need equitable pay, and we need to ensure that diversity is not just a buzzword but a fundamental principle that drives every decision. He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to tell you that the world has changed. And the companies that refuse to adapt will find themselves on the wrong side of history. The room was quiet for a moment before one of the senior lawmakers spoke up. You're right, Isaiah. We've been dancing around these issues for too long. It's time for action. And with that, the first steps toward legislative change were set in motion. It wasn't going to be easy, but Isaiah felt a surge of hope. The political machinery had finally started to turn in their favor. It was a victory, albeit a small one, but it was proof that the tides were beginning to shift. Meanwhile, back at the company, Isaiah continued to push for reforms within his own organization. His leadership had always been based on fairness, on doing what was right, but now there was an even greater sense of purpose behind every decision. He introduced a comprehensive plan to improve diversity and inclusion across all levels of the organization, from hiring practices to leadership representation. There were challenges along the way, resistance from a few senior executives, concerns about the financial impact of implementing these changes, but Isaiah stood firm. He knew that these were the changes that were necessary for the company to not only survive but thrive in a rapidly evolving world. He also implemented mentorship programs for people of color within the organization, giving them the tools, resources, and networks they needed to succeed. The company's diversity initiatives were no longer token gestures, they were built into the very DNA of the organization. As the months passed, Isaiah began to see tangible results. The company's workforce became more representative of the world around them. Employees were more engaged, more invested in their work, and more committed to the company's mission. And as more companies began to follow suit, the movement gained an unstoppable momentum. But even as success seemed within reach, Isaiah knew that this was just the beginning. The systemic issues that had plagued society for so long wouldn't be eradicated overnight. Change would take time, effort, and perseverance. But one thing was certain, the world was never going to be the same again. Isaiah's thoughts often returned to that flight, how a simple act of discrimination had set off a chain reaction that had altered the course of his life. It had been a moment of pain, a moment of humiliation, but it had also been a moment of clarity. It had shown him just how deeply ingrained inequality was in every facet of society. It had shown him that the battle for true equality was one that would require not just his voice, but the voices of millions. And as the movement gained momentum, Isaiah understood one thing above all else: true change would not come from a single man or a single company. It would come from a united, collective effort to challenge the status quo, to dismantle the systems that had perpetuated discrimination, and to ensure that the next generation, his son Elijah included, would inherit a world where they were truly free to reach their fullest potential. The journey had been long, and the challenges were far from over. But Isaiah had the unwavering belief that they were on the right path, one step at a time. And in the end, that was all they could do. Keep moving forward, together.